One of the hospitals that Israel ordered evacuated was the hospital that has now been bombed. So Israel said it was going to bomb hospitals. Then a hospital got bombed. Israel's dropped more bombs on Gaza this week than America dropped on Afghanistan in the first year of their occupation of Afghanistan in 2001. Fadi Diab, a priest in Ramallah, said, "We hold the occupying power responsible. If it's good enough for a priest, it's good enough for me." And we know that Israel continues to block electricity from baby incubators and dialysis patients. We know that Israel continues to block water from surgeons and elderly people. I mean, people in Gaza don't have access to clean water, food from survivors. And we know that Israel bombs roads after it tells people to flee along those roads. We also know that on October the 14th, Israel targeted ambulances. And we know that before this bombing, Israel had already killed 28 medical staff in Gaza. We know too, as you said, that part of the Israeli playbook is to lie about the attacks, the murders. It doesn't please me to say this. In 1996, Israel shelled a UN compound in Lebanon, blamed it on others. It wasn't true. In 2006, Israel murdered an entire family on a beach in Gaza. The IDF had a quick investigation that said the IDF wasn't responsible. It wasn't true. In 2014, Mark Regev, we've seen him again on our TV screens recently, claimed that UNRWA sites, that's UN Refugee and Works Agency sites, were used to launch missiles. The UN investigated, it wasn't true. Last year, Israeli forces murdered Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, blamed Palestinians. It wasn't true. Journalists can't really investigate what's going on in Gaza because even the Washington Post, which is not, I tell you, a friend of the Palestinian people, says it is, quote, becoming impossible to report from Gaza under the conditions of siege and bombardment that Israel has established. So part of what concerns me here, looking at the Western media, because this whole brutal siege and bombardment campaign by Israel has been an object lesson in the racism that structures everything in our media ecosystem. It has been quite, well, I want to say extraordinary, but I haven't even been that surprised to watch Western journalists rush to report an old blood libel, to rush to report that 40 babies were beheaded, bloodthirsty, savage Palestinians, even though it later turned out there wasn't much evidence for it, completely ignore, by the way, Hamas's accounts of what happened in their attack and just report the Israeli accounts. But then when Israel says, despite this record of lying, when Israel says that they're not sure who bombed this hospital or blames Palestinians for killing their own children, journalists rush to say, of course, we must be measured and take them seriously, including, I should say, some left-wing journalists. And that's concerning to people because it seems to be a kind of double standard that is reeks of racism. Raz Segal, the Israeli genocide expert, is calling what happens in Gaza a textbook case of genocide now. 800 legal scholars have written that they are, quote, compelled to sound the alarm about the possibility of genocide in Gaza. It is clear that Israel is targeting civilians. They've targeted residential buildings, they've targeted journalists, they've targeted medics and medical facilities. This isn't the first case. The question we, I think, should ask is why they're doing this. Why this brutal blanket campaign, cutting off water. If you didn't want to target civilians, you wouldn't cut off water and you wouldn't cut off fuel. Why are they doing it? They don't need to. They have an Iron Dome missile defense system that means that most missiles the Palestinians fire into Israel don't reach targets. They could negotiate the release of hostages. There are 6,000 Palestinian prisoners languishing in Israeli jails without receiving fair trials, serious allegations of torture, which we rarely hear about on the news, though we hear much about Israeli hostages in Gaza. They could negotiate for the release of their hostages. Instead, they're bombing Gaza and killing, by some reports, some of their own hostages. This won't, of course, destroy Hamas. When you carpet bomb people who are living under a colonial siege and constant bombardment, the only effect it can have is to strengthen people's fury, anger, and resolve to resist the colonizing power. So of course it won't break resistance. Even if they were to destroy the Hamas infrastructure, something else would emerge in its place. So why? Why are they doing this? It's not, by the way, because Hamas caused the problem, because in the West Bank, where there is no Hamas regime, settlers have attacked funerals in the last week and launched attacks on Palestinian villages, killing parents and children. And the IDF has shot and killed 62 Palestinians in the last week, when I last checked, in the West Bank, which is a place that does not have a Hamas government. And before this latest massacre, 2023 was already the deadliest year on record for children in the West Bank, with one child murdered every week by Israeli forces. So it isn't because there's a resistance enclave that Israel's violent. It seems to have this lashing out violent impulse regardless. The reason is that it's the logic of the colonizer. The reason is that Israelis know deep down, and I'm speaking here of some of my own family members, so it pains me but they know deep down that they are living in other people's stolen homes. They know that they are living in a state that was premised on an act of ethnic cleansing when 700,000 Palestinians were driven from their homes. That's why Gaza is so densely populated, because most of the Palestinians living in Gaza aren't from Gaza. They're refugees penned in there because they were chased out of other parts of Israel. And that's why the important thing to do now is not simply to call for peace, not simply to call for the end of this massacre, though that is crucial, but to understand that we want a world in which people don't live penned into an open-air prison because they're chased from their homes, to call not simply for peace but for freedom, and to say when we see people partying at a rave and then being killed by Hamas operatives, that they were partying 5 miles away from an open-air prison. If you move 5 miles from where those people were partying in Israel to Gaza, life expectancy drops 10 years. We don't just want peace and the return of a world in which that is the case. We desperately want people all over the world, in our millions, for freedom, for everyone to be able to live a life of freedom and dignity. And that's why we want victory for the Palestinian people.